Today we'll be going over the fan favorites of 2019 when it comes to comic books and their media adaptations. Then at the end of the video, I'll be going over 2 other related projects we'll be following up on with this one. So we just did a fun little tournament where everyone got to vote on what their favorite things were out of the year from a select group of nominees. I'm going to be going over the end results, and if you'd like to participate in other tournaments, polls, and whatever other posts we end up putting on our community page, be sure to subscribe to our channel for access to that and future content. Now, let's get to it.
Mothra, Rodan, Ghidorah.
Oh my.
First up is Godzilla King of the Monsters, a great movie that absolutely deserves recognition. This movie was a celebration of the entire Godzilla franchise, basically throwing every modern CGI effect and bit of technology at the goal of bringing the Godzilla monsters to life, and then just pretty much dedicating the majority of the movie to those monsters using Earth as a staging ground for a big, epic series of battles. The human parts are not anything to write home about, but I never found myself dreading those scenes or waiting for them to end. They were entertaining enough and gave the film a rough plot, thus allowing the focus to be where it should be, on the monster action, while giving it some context, stakes, and meaning. That's more than enough in a movie whose goals aren't really about the human drama, more so the kick-ass monster stuff, which it did so well. Number 9 is Crisis of Infinite Earths, what might be a controversial choice for some. But I truly loved this CW crossover event. I think it was really ambitious and featured so many awesome cameos and moments throughout it. If you really can't stand CW writing, which very much is on full display here from start to finish, it is at the very least worth watching some of these clips on YouTube.
Hello? What the hell is this?
At only 5 episodes long though, I found the entire experience more than worth it. This event signals a major change in the CW universe, but one that I think could help it move in a new direction. Though it was heavily tweaked towards the Arrowverse, it otherwise deeply followed the spirit of the original comic book story it is named after in a way that I thoroughly enjoyed. Number 8 is the House of X and Powers of 10 event, a truly unique entry in the top 10 in that it was the only comic book to actually make it to the fan-voted top 10. That's distinct from last year's fan list, which included a number of comic book titles including Saga, Amazing Spider-Man, and a couple of others. We'll talk a little more about this later, while I've talked at length about how powerful I think House of X is as an event already on this channel, and you can check that out by looking in the top corner here. But suffice to say, I absolutely loved House of X, and it left me wonderfully excited about the future of the X-Men in general, with me so excited to see what happens next.
I remember hearing stories about witches.
Number 7 is The Witcher, a result I was pleased to see made it to the top 10. Because The Witcher, like Godzilla, was not all that well received by critics. But I mean, fuck them, right? The Witcher is an excellent adaptation of existing material that has already been well adapted in comics and most importantly, a trilogy of video games. As such, the Witcher character has already kind of had a voice, and always had been well defined in the minds of fans, long before this series was ever even conceived of. That's what makes it so remarkable to see just how good of a job Henry Cavill does at being Geralt, with even the original author of the book series saying as much. And because of that, everything around the show, and all the events covered in the first season just sort of fall into place effortlessly. I had heard a lot about the show going in and was surprised with some of the creative choices made, but I was impressed by the end result. This show is exactly what it needed to be and wound up really balancing fantasy action with a dark dramatic story in a way I just loved. After the way that Game of Thrones chose to wrap up its show, this was a refreshing change of pace I would absolutely recommend if you missed out on it last year.
Superhero team the world's ever seen, the Seven.
After that is The Boys, a choice I can't imagine being controversial with most. This was a pretty well-received show overall from fans and critics alike, and one of those spot-on adaptations of content that was never perfect to begin with. So the show version takes the best parts of the original comic book series, shies away from the bad parts, and sets out to tell an excellent story overall, just like it should. I think the show is right where it deserves to be on this top 10 as well, right in the middle of the best the year had to offer. It wasn't game-changing in the way I've heard some critics try and claim it is, because the question of what if superheroes were jerks is hardly a new question or plot device no matter how one cuts it. And its quality isn't so high that I would say it was the absolute best that the year had to offer, but on the whole, the boy is a lot of fun with just enough depth and just enough of a distinct tone from just about everything else in the world of superheroes that it made it easily among the best 2019 had to offer.
I've got the boys together. Jonas.
To do what?
Spank the bastards.
At 5th place is HBO's Watchmen series, which I would say by far is the biggest personal surprise for me this year. I really wasn't sure what to make of this thing going in with all the press leading up to this thing. Damon Lindelof, creator of this show, is not some seal of quality, but he's always been a really down-to-earth and open-minded guy with a very friendly and welcoming online presence over the years. That positive attitude and honesty showed up in the press building up to The Watchmen, outright talking about his past shortcomings as a writer, specifically for Lost, saying that he knew for The Watchmen he'd have to better plan things out than he did for that older series. I think Lindelof also recognized how difficult the task of making the Watchmen series would be, what sort of challenges laid ahead of him, because he clearly did a lot of research, seeking out some excellent writers, and even some excellent inspiration for this series and the direction to take. He put a lot of thought into the original comic book series, that this television show, by the way, is an explicit sequel to, as opposed to the movie, but he also definitely considered the movie and the fan reaction to the Watchmen franchise as a whole, feeding into this complicated narrative that I would argue is basically perfect. I could not ask for or imagine a better, more interesting sequel to a story that, to be fair, never asked for a sequel to begin with. It's a bit of a shame that this show didn't rank higher because personally I think it deserves that, but like the original comic book series, I think in spite of its popularity, it's not actually for everyone. This show tackled some of the riskiest issues a television show can tackle in this day and age, dealing with topics such as police, white supremacy, baby squid storms, all of these controversial issues, and somehow it managed to not only present all these ideas in a creative and unique way, but nail what it was trying to say about these topics, even mirroring the clever structure of the original Watchmen comics and how it doles out information, but appropriately altering the needs of that structure for a television show as opposed to what works in a comic book graphic novel thingy. This show is excellent and one of the most fascinating things I encountered in 2019. Next up is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, a great video game, and the only video game showing up on here, but also one that just sort of feels like a victory for that particular industry, and the future of quality single-player video games. In an era where this game's own publisher, EA, seems desperate for there to very much not be a future in single-player games, opting instead for live services, it's great that Fallen Order was such a success. I liked the game, the story, and just how consistently it felt like part of the Star Wars universe, without quite dredging up every bit of nostalgia from the past, instead offering new ideas and new settings. You know, like Star Wars should have been doing from Disney all along. And that's not the only example of stuff Disney should have been doing all along, which came out in 2019 either. Because number 3 is The Mandalorian, a fantastic series I agree deserves to be ranked right around here, ever so slightly above Fallen Order and right at the top of the top 10. I think the Western theme, more unique time period, and relatively shorter episodes of The Mandalorian led to a strong show that felt deeply ingrained in the Star Wars universe, and well budgeted thanks to some of those decisions I just mentioned, but also a side of the universe we really haven't seen much before, especially in live action. I think it's so important how we are finally starting to get other Star Wars media outside of the time period of the original films. Something I think is critical if Disney ever wants Star Wars to have any sort of prolonged future with them. But independent of just about anything else that I just talked about, everything about The Mandalorian is well done all on its own. I could easily see someone who doesn't know, care, or have maybe even never heard of Star Wars just liking Mandalorian all the same, because it's simply a good sci-fi with Western themes that's a lot of fun and a great ride all on its own. At the number 2 spot is the Joker movie, which is interesting. I have a lot of mixed feelings about this one, and I'm not going to shy away from them. But this movie is a perfect length, and in spite of basically the whole thing being a series of strange choices I simply do not understand, Joaquin Phoenix's performance is kind of enough all on its own. As in, he's so damn good, I would say to anyone they should probably check out this movie for themselves if they haven't yet. Somehow, I feel like I never quite have seen anything like it before, in spite of the movies that I've seen that are like it before. It's hard to explain unless you've seen it yourself. I think it's also important in repeating a lesson to both the public and, more importantly, the film industry, that both apparently need to just keep learning over and over again, year after year, that comics don't have to just be action and adventure movies. I love action and adventure, and I love the MCU, but you only really have to read one of hundreds upon thousands of other comics out there to know that superhero fiction can be so much more than that. The good news is that The Joker is such a strong example of this with all its fancy Oscar nominations that it's going to be awfully hard for people to ignore this lesson from here on out. And finally, the number 1 is Avengers Endgame, surprising no one, and in my opinion, is right around where it should be. The reason for this is quite simple in my eyes, given how much the story is the culmination of so much content and ideas going back to the very beginning of the MCU. Well, this movie had a big emotional effect on me. And that's really all that ultimately should matter in a movie. I found the fun parts fun, I laughed, I teared up a few times, and I always understood what was happening in spite of some pretty complicated time travel mechanics. On the whole, I greatly enjoyed my time with this movie, and it was a big end of an era for Marvel and the Avengers. Things aren't going to be the same from here. It was sad to see some beloved characters go, but I enjoyed my time with it and them. With an avalanche of cool moments I just love, I absolutely think this movie deserves the credit it got from our viewers. Endgame is the culmination of decades of work from thousands of people all working under the banner of the MCU. The best of 2018 results included Infinity War at number 1. And while I won't go so far as to claim Endgame was better or even as good as its predecessor, I absolutely enjoyed every minute of this movie, and definitely it still stood out in 2019 in a way that turned out to be otherwise pretty weak in terms of MCU entries. You'll notice Endgame is alone on the top 10 in that regard, as neither Spider-Man Far From Home nor Captain Marvel even came close to getting to this top 10. This was not an automatic victory for Marvel or the MCU. Endgame spoke to our audience far more than their other stuff this year, and I'm inclined to agree with that sentiment. This movie was special compared to their other 2 entries this year, which felt comparatively lackluster. And that's it for the year. Yes, comics did get a bit excluded out of this top 10, but I will point out, it's not so much that this one happened to get dominated by movies. That was more of TV shows this year. And I think the reason for that is quite simple. There was a lot of different streaming services out there trying really, really hard to cement themselves as this sort of status symbol in terms of being, streaming giant. This is all new. We don't have names for all this stuff yet, but you get what I'm saying. So I kind of understand how this happened, because in a year where you have The Watchmen, Boys, Witcher, and The Mandalorian, any of which would have stood out in a huge way in any other year, well, then the comics are going to naturally be the ones who are ultimately crowded out. But just the same, in spite of the huge victory that means for House of X, which still got on the top 10 in spite of all of that, we didn't get to talk about any other comics in this top 10. So next up, we're going to talk about 10 great comics with my own personal top 10 comic books of 2019. So thanks for watching, stay tuned for that, and let me know what you think in the comments section below. Finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.